Welcome, everybody. Welcome back, you could say, for this second edition of Faith and Politics. I'm Pastor Aidan MacKenzie. Good to have you on video. Good to have the folks here who are actually here and braving a rather wintry night on the coast. In any case, it's good to be able to go through this seasonally, because we do have a bit of a seasonal presentation of Faith and Politics today, as we're going to be talking a little bit about the Magi account from Matthew's Gospel and how that relates to the Parthian Kingdom. And with me on that is my son, Aidan MacKenzie. He's normally from Calgary, and he's done his studies in terms of his bachelor degree in history, and has a real fondness for the ancient Middle East on a number of levels, and so that all works. So in any case, we're going to move forward with this and present an interesting, I think, presentation on the actual Magi and the Parthian Kingdom. And so to that end, let's open up in a word of prayer before we get started. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you, Lord, for this moment, oh Lord, where we can take a look at a particular specific element in history and how it relates to Scripture. We pray for Aidan at this time, and we pray for your mercy in the midst of this discussion. We pray for all those who are joining us on video as well, and we pray that this might be edifying and illuminating at the same time. And we give you thanks for this season of Christmas tide moving in the direction of Epiphany. Lord, the timing seems right for something like this, and so we commend it into your hands. We pray for your Holy Spirit's help in the midst of these things, that we might understand this type of connection of faith and politics. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So once again, here is Aidan MacKenzie to take it away for this particular evening. Aidan.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for making it out tonight. And yes, we're going to be talking about the Parthian Empire and the Magi and how they are related. I will actually say, though, as my research sort of went on, I found that we spent probably more time in the Hasmonean Kingdom of Judea than actually in Parthia, but the Parthians are kind of the important players here. So let's get going. There we go. Okay, there we go. Hey, it's working. All right, yeah, so first section here, I just want to give a brief overview about the Parthians, basically who they were, where they came from, as brief as I can manage overview of their history. Cool, that is one slide too far, thank you very much. So the earliest reference that we have to the Parthians, it comes from what's known as the Behistun inscription in the Persian Empire. It's basically the inscription that was given, if I'm not mistaken, by King Darius I, basically as an explanation of why he seized the throne of the Persian Empire. It is an absolutely thrilling tale of very realistic impersonations of people and conspiracies and plots and all that, and probably mostly bunk and propaganda, but a very, very interesting tale nonetheless. But for our purposes here, its significance is that it does specifically denote the Parthians, or rather the region of Parthia, as one of the satrapies of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And I should point out, we are talking about the Achaemenid Persians here. They are the Persians, probably the most famous iteration of the Persian Empire. They're the ones that clashed with the Greeks at Thermopylae and Salamis and Marathon and all the rest of them. But there's been several iterations of the Persian Empire over the course of history, and if I'm not mistaken, the most recent one didn't actually end until the 1970s. So yeah, there's been several Persian empires over the course of history. The first and most famous one is the Achaemenid Persians, and that's who we're talking about in this case. Not really much else is known about Parthia during the Achaemenid period. The Parthians come into a lot more prominence during the reign of Alexander the Great, so we're going to just hop over there right away. So, let's advance that. There we go. So in late 331 BC, Alexander the Great wins the decisive battle of his campaign against the Achaemenid Persians at the Battle of Gaugamela. The defeated Persian king, Darius III, flees northeast to the sort of eastern provinces of the Achaemenid Persian realm to attempt to drum up support. Meanwhile, Alexander and company advanced to the Persian cultural capital called Persepolis. They winter winter over there and infamously loot and burn it before they go. But after wintering there, they set out in pursuit of Darius III the following year. By July of 330 BC, Darius is beginning to move through Parthia. However, he doesn't make it far. Eventually, one of his own retainers, a guy by the name of Bessus, assassinates him. Apparently, just as Alexander's vanguard wasn't too far away, because the story goes that the vanguard of Alexander's troops actually find Darius, and he's still actually alive. He dies shortly thereafter. After the assassination of Darius, the remainder of Parthia, under its leader, a guy by the name of Phrataphernes, I believe, submits to Alexander. All right, so moving on. There we go. There's a little bit of a lag on the button there. So after Alexander the Great dies in 323 BC in Babylon on his way back from campaigning in India, technically what is now Pakistan, but thought of at that point as India, his empire immediately falls into crisis. There is no clear succession for Alexander the Great when he dies. His son is yet to be born. He doesn't, of course, they don't even know that it's a son yet. They just know that his wife is pregnant. It does end up being a son, but of course, it's a newborn baby, so not really that good at ruling the largest empire the world had seen up to that point. The other sort of legitimate contender to the throne, Alexander's half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus, seems to have suffered from some manner of cognitive impairment. We're not quite sure the nature of it, but he is referred to in ancient sources variously as simple-minded. He's not completely incompetent, but he's also not someone you want necessarily ruling a kingdom. So as a result, a series of wars breaks out between Alexander the Great's generals, known as the Wars of the Successors, or in Greek, the Wars of the Diadochoi. It lasts for about 40 years. It's a really, really interesting period of time, and also not the subject of this talk, and so we're not going to go into it. But the important part is, for our purposes here, is that when the conflict settles, most of the eastern territories, especially Syria and Mesopotamia, and then eastward into Parthia, it belongs to Seleucus I, known as Seleucus Nicator, or the victor. However, the Seleucid Empire did suffer from a major problem, that it was very, very badly overextended. And as a consequence, its hold on its more peripheral satrapies were tenuous at best. Satrapies, by the way, for those of you who don't know, are basically provinces. Satrap is basically a governor. It was the Persian term for him. The Seleucid Empire, especially from the 2nd century BC, was also plagued by constant infighting as well. And as a result, beginning in the mid-3rd century BC, some of the satrapies on its periphery begin to break away. The first one to do so is Bactria, under its satrap Diodotus, which declared independence sometime between 255 and 245 BC. Following Diodotus' lead, the satrap of Parthia, a guy named Antagonists, also declared independence about 10 years later, we think around 245 BC. Enter the Parni. The Parni were a Central Eurasian steppe nomadic group, not entirely unlike, say, the Huns or the Mongols, right? Obviously the Huns and Mongols came much later, but, same approximate culture. And they migrated from Central Asia into the region, and they begin to sort of probe the defenses of the Seleucid Empire, starting kind of in the late 4th, early 3rd centuries BC. They attempt to attack Bactria, but this invasion was repelled. However, the Parni remain this constant sort of menace on the Seleucid border. Now, when the satrapies of Bactria and Parthia break away from the Seleucid Empire, the Parni, well, they still remember the beatdown they got the last time they tried to bother Bactria, and so they attack Parthia instead. In this attack, they actually end up being supported by the Parthian people, and Antagonists, as a result, is not able to hold the territory. Of course, he doesn't have Seleucid backing, so he can't call on the broader military power of the Seleucid Empire, and the Parni, under their king Arsaces I, overrun the satrapy of Parthia and become its new rulers. They actually take the name Parthians themselves. So around 210 BC, 30 or so years later, the Seleucids, under one of their more powerful kings by the name of Antiochus III, were actually able to briefly compel the Parthians to accept vassal status again. However, this doesn't really last for any long period of time. The Seleucids under Antiochus III, also called Antiochus the Great, make the mistake of picking a fight with Rome, which they do not win. And in the Treaty of Apamea, which I believe is in 188 BC, the Romans force the Seleucids to give up a huge amount of their territory, and the Seleucids begin to slide into political infighting from that point, and their power begins to ebb away. By contrast, the Parthians, under their Arsacid dynasty, named obviously after its founder, Arsaces I, continues to gain in power. By the time you get to the mid-2nd century BC, under their king Mithridates I, the Parthians begin to expand rather aggressively, and by the time you reach the early 1st century BC, under Mithridates II, the Parthians are essentially the most powerful political entity in the Near East, and they're beginning to bump up against the also expanding Roman state. And so just to give you a little bit of a sense of things here, so the coloring is a little bit weird to see, but this is the Parthian Empire at its maximum extent under Mithridates II, sort of at the beginning of the 1st century BC, so let's say 90s BC roughly. Now that's a little bit of an overview of who the Parthians were, where they came from, up to the 1st century BC. That's not really super important, it's just to more give you context. The important part for the purposes of this lecture is actually the structure of their government and a little bit about their society. So we're going to go on to talk a little bit about that here. That is too far. If we could just back it off to Parthian politics, the slide Parthian politics. Thank you very much. So yes, the Parthians were a monarchy. They were ruled by a dynasty called the Arsacids. Throughout their entire history, they were always ruled by an Arsacid monarch. There was no non-Arsacid monarchs. There was no dynastic overturn. And in fact, they would eventually come to place Arsacid monarchs on a lot of the smaller kingdoms surrounding them. Interestingly enough, one of those kingdoms that they placed an Arsacid monarch on the throne of is the kingdom of Armenia. And one of those Arsacid kings of Armenia, Tiridates III, would convert to Christianity around the beginning of the 4th century AD, after the ministry of St. Gregory the Illuminator, and Armenia would become the first kingdom to officially adopt Christianity as the state religion. Technically, actually, the kingdom of Osrhoene did that a few decades earlier, but then they immediately got annexed by Rome and never reemerged, whereas, Armenia, obviously in a slightly different form, still exists to this day. So that's just a little bit of trivia there of what the Arsacids ultimately got up to, and their somewhat interesting legacy as far as Christian political history is concerned. But anyway, the Arsacids were always the ruling dynasty of the Parthian Empire. But advising the king was a council. Now this was known, according to Strabo, as the Synhedrion, which, by the way, is cognate with the word Sanhedrin, which was the council that was present in Jerusalem as well, much later on. Well, not much later on, but, getting into the 1st century BC, 1st century AD. I've also seen it termed as the Magistan or the Megisthenes. However, I wasn't actually able to find where that term comes from, and so I chose not to include it on my PowerPoint notes, although I'm telling you about it now. So I don't know where that word comes from. I'm not saying it's not legitimate, I'm just saying I couldn't find it in my research. But anyway, according to Strabo, it's called the Synhedrion. Now this council was bicameral, which is a fancy term basically meaning divided into 2 houses. Same, as our legislative branch here in Canada is as well. We have the lower house, the House of Commons, and then the upper house, the Senate, right? And in the United States, their legislature is also bicameral. Britain, same thing, right? So in this case, this wasn't necessarily democratic, it was more oligarchic, but it was nevertheless bicameral. The upper house, in the case of the Parthian Synhedrion, was comprised of members of the aristocracy, specifically what were known as the 7 great families of Parthia. The lower house, though, is what's more interesting for our purposes here. And that was comprised of the, quote, wise men, which presumably I can only assume means secular scholars and learned men, and the Magi, which I believe refers to essentially members of the priestly class. Now, the Parthians were Zoroastrian, and again, that's just a little bit of, just to give you a little bit of context about what we're talking about when we're talking about the priestly class. I'm not going to really go into Zoroastrianism very much, but that is the religion that they followed for the most part. Now, Strabo, who is a Greek geographer living not too long, I think it's sort of early to mid-1st century AD, if I remember correctly. Now, he's referencing another work by a guy named Posidonius, and he says that the Parthian Synhedrion had some involvement in the selection of Parthian kings, although their exact role in this isn't exactly clear. The line in Strabo, if I remember correctly, is that from both of these houses, the kings are chosen. He doesn't really elaborate beyond that. So it's not entirely clear what that means, but they have apparently some role in the selection of Parthian kings. Now I want to take a moment here to talk also about Parthian royal titulary, which is basically just what the kings of Parthia called themselves. Now, they, like a lot of ancient Near Eastern monarchs, they sort of accumulated this really long list of grandiose titles, which are actually quite fun. Now, the earliest Parthian rulers didn't actually call themselves king. They used the term autokrateros, or autocrat. And that's because they were technically vassals of the Seleucid Empire, at least early on. However, all Parthian kings and Parthian rulers included the name of the dynastic founder Arsaces I, which in Greek is usually rendered in their titles as Arsaku, as part of their royal title. So you'll hear, kings not named Arsaces calling themselves the Great King Arsaces, so that can be a little bit confusing unless you have that as a little bit of context. And as the Parthians grew in power, the royal titles became more elaborate and boastful. So when you get around to Mithridates I, who reigns from about 165 to 132 BC, he describes himself as Basileus Arsaku Megalou Philelenos, meaning King Arsaces the Great, friend of the Greeks. And it only goes up from there. Mithridates I, I keep forgetting I have two different things I have to press the button on. Phraates II adds the title Philopatros, meaning the filial, or literally one who loves his father, and Theopatros, meaning son of a god, to his titles. Mithridates II, who is the guy who takes the Parthian Empire to its greatest territorial extent, he begins his reign with the relatively humble title of Basileus Megalou Arsaku Epiphanos, meaning the great King Arsaces the Manifest. However, by the end of his reign, Mithridates II had expanded his title to include including the adoption of the Old Persian title King of Kings. Now, in Old Persian, that is, and my Old Persian pronunciation is probably completely off here, so bear with me, but it's something like Kshayathia. However, the Parthians, they're a really interesting culture because they're sort of, as I said, part steppe nomad, part Persian, and also part Greek. They use the Greek form of that, which is much easier to say, which is Basileus Basileon. So his full title, Mithridates II, becomes Basileus Basileon Megalou Arsaku Epiphanos, or the Great King of Kings, Arsaces the Manifest. The later king, Orodes II, has an even more grandiose title. We're going to be talking a little bit more about Orodes II in a little while, and actually a lot about his son Pacorus. The King Orodes II has the full title of Basileus Basileon Arsaku Euagetu Dikeu Epiphanus Philelenos, or the King of Kings, Arsaces, the benefactor, the just, the manifest, friend of the Greeks. So yeah, nothing but humility there. Now, why is this interesting? Well, I want to bring this back to this sort of faith standpoint of all this. When you analyze the scripture somewhat closely, you'll find that it's actually rather chock full of deliberate correctives to a lot of the culture around it. So, for example, one of the things that I learned relatively recently, thanks to an episode of a really, really excellent podcast called The Lord of Spirits, which is an Eastern Orthodox podcast, theology podcast, is that Psalm 24 is a deliberate swipe at Phoenician Baal worship. We didn't actually know that until relatively recently, when the ruins of the city of, Ugarit, that's right, was discovered, and we discovered the works of literature known as the Baal cycles. And the ways in which Psalm 24 is swiping at the Baal cycles is a little bit lost in the English translation, but it is actually there. Likewise, one of the things I learned in a history of early Christianity class that I took in university is that the creation account in Genesis, Genesis 1 and 2, is deliberately communicated in such a way as to evoke the structure of an ancient Near Eastern temple complex, which is very, very interesting. Now, the same pattern, I think, can be witnessed here to some degree in the royal titulary of the Parthian monarchs in light of the Christmas account. And, it's very, very interesting that titles like Epiphanos, the manifest, Basileus, Basileon, king of kings, and Theopatros, son of God, would all be attached ultimately in one way or another to Christ. Remember, we're actually coming up very quickly on the Feast of the Epiphany, which you can probably tell is related to the term Epiphanos, meaning the manifest. A particular villain from this period, a guy by the name of Antiochus IV, he would take a similar title to Epiphanos. He would call himself Antiochus Epiphanes, which literally in that case meant, Antiochus the manifest God. This is the guy who attempts to erect the image of Zeus in the temple in Jerusalem and provokes the Maccabean revolt, which we'll be talking a little bit about in a few minutes' time. And just as a little bit of an aside that's kind of funny, he wasn't very popular among his own nobles and retainers, and so even though he officially called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, a lot of his detractors called him Antiochus Epimanes, which meant the insane. All right, so now we're going to take a walk through a period of history that covers essentially the first half of the 1st century BC. Things are going to get a little bit confusing. I boiled them down as much as I could, but they're still confusing. And so if anything is confusing, I'm actually going to sort of open it up to people that if I've lost you at any point, just put your hand up and sort of ask and I'll try to clarify. Because we're going to get to a point, not immediately, but we're going to get there where you have like 3 overlapping conflicts that all sort of come together, and it's complicated. But before we get there, we're going to talk a little bit about the Romans and the Hasmoneans at this period of time. Alrighty. So the Parthians, of course, were not the only ascendant power in the region at this time. And I'm probably not telling anyone anything new here. We all know that the Romans are coming. In the early 1st century BC, the Parthians, as they were expanding under Mithridates II, would first come into contact with the also expanding Romans as they expanded into the region. Now, sometime during the mid to late 90s BC, during the reign of Mithridates II, the Romans and the Parthians actually first met and hammered out where their official border would be. They fixed it at the Euphrates River. However, despite the early diplomatic success, relations between Rome and Parthia would quickly deteriorate, which is, of course, predictable when you're talking about 2 expansionist imperial powers. The biggest thing that was at issue, at least at first, was whether the quite powerful kingdom of Armenia would primarily be under Roman influence or would primarily be under Parthian influence. It wasn't exactly clear at first. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the Roman East. Now, Rome had been politically and militarily active in the Near East since the war with Antiochus III and the Seleucids back at the beginning of the 2nd century BC, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. However, they didn't really formally hold territory there. This would, however, change in the late 2nd century BC. In the year 133 BC, the king of the Kingdom of Pergamon, which is located in southwest Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, a guy by the name of Attalus III, died. And in his will, he bequeathed his entire kingdom to the Senate and people of Rome, which was really, really great for the Romans because it just so happened that they were in the middle of an extremely controversial land reform bill, the Lex Agraria, I think, pioneered by Tiberius Tiberius Gracchus, this would be so destructive to the Roman social fabric that it actually laid the groundwork for the collapse of the Roman Republic about 100 years later. So once we actually get into the mid-1st century BC, you're going to be noticing that there's a really, well, you might notice that there's going to be a really rapid overturn of the major Roman characters in the region, and that's not an accident. There's basically a litany of civil wars going on in Roman territory in the background here. Anyway, but this is how Rome in the first instance actually ends up on the east side of the Aegean. And they just sort of continue expanding from there. By 63 BC, Rome puts the Seleucid Empire out of its misery. The Seleucids have been chronically declining for a few decades at this point. In 63 BC, Rome simply annexes the rest of its territory and deposes and kills its last king, Antiochus the 13th, I think, if I remember correctly. I don't actually have that in my notes. That's something that I'm just going off the top of my head. Alrighty, there we go. Now, at this early stage, however, Rome still prefers to rule, or at least exert its influence in the region through the use of client kingdoms. It tries to avoid annexing territory directly when it can, with the one exception being Syria, which we already mentioned. And these kingdoms, they stretch roughly in a line down from the Caucasus in the north to the Red Sea in the south. And they serve both as kingdoms to exert influence over, as well as providing a buffer between the Parthians and the Romans. One of these kingdoms was the Hasmonean kingdom. But first, here's a few maps to give you a little bit of a sense of what's going on here. All right, so here, if you can see, this is some of those kingdoms. You can't really see it, unfortunately, on the PowerPoint here. But here in the part labeled Arabia, that's the kingdom of Nabatea. Here in the light yellow is the Hasmonean kingdom. A little further there, sort of where Lebanon is now, you have the area called Celesyria. Then you have you have Syria proper. I think at the time that this map is representing, that's like the last vestiges of the Seleucid Empire, the sort of dark yellow there. North of that is the kingdom of Osroene, and then I think it's Sophene, I believe, is north of that, and then Armenia north of that. Commagene is another kingdom that's in there. There's also another kingdom called Chalcis, which we'll run into in a little bit. But I thought that was a reasonably good map. It gives you a little bit of a sense of kind of what's going on in the region there. And likewise, this is sort of what Rome looks like at around the mid 1st century BC, so roughly 50 BC. And so you can see, they occupy kind of Syria, but they don't occupy, much in the middle of Anatolia, and then sort of down where the Hasmonean kingdom is, where modern Israel is, and things like that. And then the green over there in the corner is the westernmost extent of the Parthian Empire. And the blue down there is the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, which does still exist at this point, and would until 31 BC, roughly. All right. Okay, so we mentioned a little bit earlier about Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and he really, really does his level best to provoke the Jewish people, and a revolt breaks out. And that happens around 167 BC. This revolt actually is chronicled really in two books of the biblical Deuterocanon, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Most Protestant Bibles don't include the Deuterocanon and therefore don't have 1st and 2nd Maccabees, but Catholic Bibles, Eastern Orthodox Bibles, Oriental Orthodox Bibles, for the most part will. Now the fortune of war shifts back and forth, but ultimately the Jewish Hasmonean kingdom is successfully established. Now, they, somewhat like the Parthians at first, they don't immediately take the title king. They take at various points the title prince or ethnarch, but they do come to take the title of king. And they very often, the Hasmonean rulers, very often occupy the offices both of king and high priest. Now, this kingdom reaches the height of its power during the reigns of a man by the name of Alexander Jannaeus, and then after his death, his wife Alexandra Salome. And And she rules in her own right for several years. Interestingly enough, it's during the reign of Alexander Salome that the Pharisees first come to political power. They had existed already as a religious sect, but during the reign of Alexander Salome, they sort of attained to a certain level of political power. And when I say a certain level, Josephus describes them as essentially running the kingdom. And so here's a little bit of a map. The green there is roughly the Hasmonean kingdom before Alexander Jannaeus' reign. The purple is what he added during the course of his reign. Alexander Jannaeus is not really known for being a super nice guy. He was kind of known for being extremely warlike and bellicose, and of course that's warlike and bellicose by the standards of the ancient world, so you know it's bad. But he was apparently successful, so there you go. Now, Alexander and Alexandra have a pair of sons, and you can probably already see where this is going. And this is where things are going to start getting complicated. So, if basically between now and like the end of the presentation, if I lose you, let me know, and I'll try to clarify. Now, Alexander, before he dies, he already sort of sees the simmering rivalry between his two sons. The two sons, by the way, they are named Aristobulus, technically Aristobulus II, and Hyrcanus, likewise Hyrcanus II. Now, Alexander and Alexandra do their level best to try to stop their sons from fighting. They fail. Now, according to Josephus, Alexander Jannaeus prefers Hyrcanus to be his heir due to his more even temper, but Aristobulus enjoyed more support from the army. And as a result, when conflict broke out after the death of their father, Aristobulus was able to get the better of Hyrcanus. Alrighty. Now, Hyrcanus, however, does have one major asset. He has a very capable advisor named Antipater. Now, Antipater was ethnically an Idumean, basically a descendant of the biblical Edomites. And according to Josephus, he had a personal dislike for Aristobulus. And so he really sort of, curried favor with Hyrcanus and sort of became his chief advisor. Now, on Antipater's advice, Hyrcanus flees the kingdom after being defeated militarily by Aristobulus. And he takes refuge in the neighboring kingdom of Nabatea, which is centered around Petra. If you've ever seen that famous kind of like rock, like city kind of carved into the rocks near Petra in modern-day Jordan, that was the kingdom of Nabatea. I mean, that wasn't just the kingdom of Nabatea, but that was in the kingdom of Nabatea. The king of Nabatea, a guy by the name of Aretas III, agreed to help restore Hyrcanus to the throne and launched an invasion of the Hasmonean kingdom. However, he was forced to withdraw under pressure from the Romans under the command of a guy named Marcus Aemilius Scaurus. Now, you don't really have to remember his name. That's who he was. He was the lieutenant of a very famous general, however, whose name you really should know, just in general, not just for the purpose of this presentation, Pompey or Pompey the Great, who at that time was campaigning in Armenia to the north. Now, both Aristobulus and Hyrcanus subsequently send embassies to Pompey himself. Initially, Pompey supports Aristobulus because Aristobulus basically bribed him. However, Aristobulus was known for a certain ego, and that alienated the Romans, who naturally had their own ego and didn't like someone else with an ego encroaching on their ego. And as a result, Aristobulus lost the support of Pompey. And instead, he switched to supporting the much more pliant, humble Hyrcanus. And so in 64-63 BC, Pompey launched an invasion of the Hasmonean kingdom. Aristobulus initially sues for peace, but then just doesn't actually deliver anything that he promises. And so Pompey just continues to prosecute the campaign and lays siege to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was itself riven with bloody civil conflict because there were basically partisans of both Hyrcanus and Aristobulus within the city that, as the Romans approached, descended into fighting each other. When the Roman army arrived, the faction that supported Hyrcanus actually got the better of the fighting in the city and opened the gates to the Romans. Aristobulus' partisans retreated back to the Temple Mount, which was itself quite highly defensible. And they resisted there, very doggedly, and it was a bloody fight to actually take the temple. Pompey was quite impressed, according to Josephus, with the fortitude of the Jews, as well as their commitment to, even in the midst of the siege, making sure all of their religious practices were carried out. There was, he even records that when ultimately Pompey takes the Temple Mount, basically some of the priests are cut down, still performing the religious rites. In the end, it is a difficult fight, but the Romans, as I said, do break in. They do storm the temple. According to Josephus, 12,000 Jews of Aristobulus' faction were killed in the fighting. Whether that is an actual sort of estimate or whether that's supposed to be symbolic, because of course the number 12 is very symbolically important to the Jewish people. I don't know. It could go either way, really. Famously, Pompey himself entered the temple and even went into the Holy of Holies. However, he didn't sort of desecrate the temple in the same way that Antiochus IV much earlier had. He actually seemed to have been relatively respectful of the Jews and immediately sort of restored their ownership of the Temple Mount and told them to carry out their ritual purification of the temple and continue to sort of practice their religion.
So, Aidan,
Yep.
so the temple we're talking about, is that the one that was restored under Nehemiah? Because Herod's temple doesn't begin yet at that point.
Yes, yeah, that'd be correct. So the question was, for those of you who might not have heard it on the recording, was this the temple that was restored by Nehemiah? As far as I'm aware, the answer is yes. Because Herod later on also sort of rebuilds the temple. That does come further down the road. Because we haven't reached Herod quite yet. Now after the siege, Hyrcanus was restored to the high priesthood, but he was not granted the kingship. The Romans try various things to avoid putting a king in the Hasmonean kingdom presumably because they thought that would actually sort of just contribute to the instability of the region. So they at first try to install an oligarchy. Later on, they'll make the sons of Antipater a tetrarchy. But the point for our purposes here is that Hyrcanus is restored to the high priesthood, but not the kingship. And the Hasmonean kingdom was rendered a Roman client state. Aristobulus and his family do survive the siege, and they are taken as prisoners to Rome. However, it should be noted that the eldest son of Aristobulus, a guy named Alexander, does escape, immediately returns to Judea, and begins an uprising there, which will simmer on and off for the next several years. Meanwhile, Antipater took this opportunity to ingratiate himself to the Romans. The subsequent decades saw Antipater actively assisting whichever Roman general was most prominent at the time. One of the good examples of this was in 47 BC. Alexander participates in an invasion of Egypt to help relieve Julius Caesar, who was under siege at that time in Alexandria. Sometime after this campaign, Antipater marries an aristocratic woman named Kypros. And he and Kypros would have 4 sons together, of whom the elder 2 are the most prominent. The eldest was named Phasaelus. The second was named Herod. Yes, that Herod. All right. Now, after spending some time as Roman prisoners, Aristobulus and his family were ultimately permitted to return to Judea sometime around 49 BC. However, Aristobulus himself was assassinated by some political rivals shortly thereafter. To give you some indication as to kind of what's going on in the background here and why this is happening. What has just happened here is that Julius Caesar has defeated Pompey the Great. And Pompey is he goes to Egypt and is killed. That's actually why Julius Caesar is hanging out in Alexandria, which sees him ultimately get besieged. And because, of course, Hyrcanus and Antipater were supported by Pompey, Julius Caesar wanted to send Aristobulus and company back who were more loyal to him. However, of course, Antipater aggressively ingratiates himself to Julius Caesar. And Aristobulus, as it says here, never really makes it back. He is assassinated by political rivals shortly thereafter. Aristobulus' eldest son, who I mentioned a minute ago, started an uprising in Judea after he escaped Roman captivity. He is defeated, captured, and subsequently executed And that really leaves Aristobulus' second son, a man by the name of Antigonus. However, he was able to avoid death at this time thanks to a political marriage. Antigonus' sister marries the king of Chalcis. And it's a charmingly romantic story. Allow me to recall it to you, or recount it to you. The king of Chalcis sends his son to negotiate for the release of Antigonus, and falls in love with Antigonus' sister, where he becomes engaged to her, goes back to the kingdom of Chalcis, says, "Hey dad, I met this girl and I'm engaged to her." His dad says, "Yeah, well done, son, she is a real beauty," and then immediately murders his son and marries her himself. So yeah, that's what's going on at the petty kingdom of Chalcis at this time. However, as nasty as that was, it does work out well for Antigonus because he's able to live there because his sister is married to the king. Yeah. Now, Antigonus would appeal to Julius Caesar for support for his cause. However, he had really poetically bad timing. Because, as I've said many times, Antipater does his best to ingratiate himself to any Roman officer who's really prominent at the time. And so, guess who else is there talking to Julius Caesar right at that very moment? Why, Antipater, of course. There is this the debate between them which broke out culminates in a really dramatic episode where when Antigonus sort of levels his accusations at Antipater, Antipater apparently rips off all of his garments and shows all the scars that he has in service, that he got in service of Rome. And this impresses Julius Caesar so much that he doubles down on support for Antipater. And Julius Caesar would then go on to name Antipater the procurator of all of Syria. Antigonus himself returns to Chalcis with no choice but to look elsewhere for support, and yes, that is called foreshadowing. Now, after receiving his promotion to procurator, Antipater sets about making various reforms and renovations to the kingdom, to the Hasmonean kingdom. He rebuilds Jerusalem's damaged walls and suppresses any nation political instability. He also sort of rebuilds a whole bunch of other cities that have been damaged in the previous several years fighting. And he promotes his eldest two sons as well. So Phasaelus gets named governor of Jerusalem, and Herod the governor of Galilee. Hyrcanus is still around, and Hyrcanus will be around for some time, but he was proving to be a very weak leader, and was criticized very harshly for that reason. Alrighty. But the Roman world itself was in turmoil. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar famously was assassinated by a coalition of political rivals led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. And another round of Roman civil wars almost immediately breaks out. This is what's known as the Liberators Civil War. Again, a very interesting conflict. That's not the subject of our talk tonight, but well worth looking into if you guys are interested in this sort of thing. The faction led by Brutus and Cassius immediately established themselves in the eastern provinces, and they set about gathering troops and resources. Herod immediately ingratiates himself. Herod inherits a lot of his father's political acumen, and so he ingratiates himself to Brutus and Cassius. When he's asked for a tribute, he brings it very quickly, and basically says, "What else can I do for you?" And this impresses Brutus and Cassius. And Cassius promises Herod to make him king of Judea after the war. And he also names Herod procurator of Syria, which of course his father had just recently held. However, at about this time, within the Hasmonean kingdom, Herod's father, Antipater, is also assassinated by some political rivals who were fearful of his family's growing power. And now we arrive at what I've kind of been building to, which is the War of 40 BC. But before that, we really have to start with the end of the Liberators Civil War. So in October 42 BC, the civil war that broke out after Julius Caesar's assassination, again called the Liberators Civil War, was brought to an end. It's brought to an end at the Battle of Philippi, where the forces of Brutus and Cassius, who remained active, who were active in the eastern Mediterranean, were ultimately decisively beaten by the forces of Mark Antony and Octavian. There was, however, one final guy in Brutus and Cassius' faction who is still active in the region, and that was a guy by the name of Quintus Labienus. And now he had been sent by Brutus and Cassius as an embassy to King Herods II. You remember him from earlier, the guy with the long and ostentatious title. He had been sent to him to see if he could negotiate an alliance with the Parthians. But Herodes had deliberately stalled. He was sort of hedging his bets. He didn't want to sort of back the wrong horse here. And so he stalled, and as a result, no Parthian aid was forthcoming at the time of the Battle of Philippi. Now, when the news of the outcome of the Battle of Philippi reached Labienus decided to remain there instead of returning to Rome, even if there was an off chance that he might be granted amnesty. Instead, he waited until things quieted down in the Roman East, and specifically he was waiting for Mark Antony to head to Egypt. Mark Antony famously, of course, had his romantic relationship with the Queen Cleopatra VII. Both Cassius Dio, Plutarch, and Josephus all say that it was like, he was like weirdly obsessed with her, and nowadays we might call him a simp. That's sort of a, thing that the Zoomers are all saying nowadays. Now, once things had settled down, Labienus did successfully convince Herodes II to launch an invasion of Rome's eastern territories. Herodes agreed, and puts both Labienus and the Parthian crown prince Pacorus in charge of the invasion. In 40 BC, the Parthians crossed into Syria. They attacked the city of Apamea, and although this actual first assault is rebuffed, a whole bunch of the Roman garrison troops immediately defect to Labienus, because these guys were veterans of the former civil wars. They had backed the Pompeian cause and then the cause of Brutus and Cassius. And so it didn't take a lot of convincing for them to come over to Labienus, who was sort of the last major figure of that faction. Now, in a subsequent field battle, the Parthians and the Romans who were loyal to Labienus were able to score a major victory. The ranking Roman commander in the region, a man by the name of Lucius Decidius Saxa, fled north first to Antioch, but seeing that he probably couldn't hold it, he then fled into Cilicia. However, he was pursued by Labienus and Pacorus, who captured him in Cilicia and executed him shortly thereafter. Pacorus would overrun all of Syria and Phoenicia, with the exception of Tyre, which held out. So Pacorus basically goes south, and Labienus, for his part, turns north and takes Cilicia. Now, Antagonists, who's also known as Antigonus Mattathias, who's the son of Aristobulus, he has, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, been living in exile in the small kingdom of Chalcis. Now, when the Parthians had successfully overrun Syria and Phoenicia, Antigonus and the king of Chalcis, at this point named Lysanias, not the same guy who had, done the weird thing to get a wife, not that guy, but his successor, Lysanias, he sent envoys to one of Pacorus's lieutenants, a guy by the name of Barzani. And they offered the Parthians a large tribute if they would agree to launch an invasion of the Hasmonean kingdom and place Antigonus on the throne. The Parthians agreed. Now, although Crown Prince Pacorus himself was busy in Phoenicia trying to put pressure on the city of Tyre, which, as we said, was still holding out, he does commission Barzapharnes and one of his lieutenants, confusingly also named Pacorus, to invade Judea. This, at least according to Josephus. As their army advanced, many local Jews flocked to them to support Antigonus. Herod and Phasaelus sent an army to contest the advance, but the Parthians and the pro-Antigonist Jews defeated them and continued their advance on Jerusalem. And just like before the siege of 63 BC, here again the city of Jerusalem descends into factional violence at the approach of the Parthian army. Now, according to Josephus, Antagonists planned not to take Jerusalem by a siege, but rather to take it essentially by an act of sedition. He convinced Pacorus, again, this isn't the crown prince, Pacorus, this is one of his sort of deputies, to actually reach out to Hyrcanus and Phasaelus and Herod, and with the pretense of offering to act as an arbitrator in the dispute. And he seems to actually convince Phasaelus of this, who admits him and 500 Parthian cavalry into the city of Jerusalem. Phasaelus is then told to go with Hyrcanus, the high priest, to seek out Barzapharnes, who you'll remember is the other Parthian commander here, to actually plead their case. Herod, however, smells a rat, and he refuses to go and instead stays holed up in Jerusalem. There we go. Now, while the embassy was on its way to Barzapharnes, Phasaelus does find out about the plan from an informant, I believe, named Ophelius, according to Josephus. However, he refuses to flee, even though he sort of has the opportunity to, because he doesn't want to abandon Hyrcanus. Instead, he goes to Barzapharnes and reveals that he knows about the plot. Now, Barzapharnes at first sort of plays dumb, and he says that no, this is all a big misunderstanding. And he, according to Josephus, is profuse with his apologies and his oaths, sort of swearing that he has no bad intentions. But then shortly thereafter, of course, Hyrcanus and Phasaelus are seized and imprisoned. Oh, that's one slide too far. Thank you very much. Now, the Parthians tried again to lure Herod out of Jerusalem, but they fail again. Now, while the Lieutenant Pacorus was trying to devise a new way to see if he could somehow get around Herod, Herod apparently somehow finds out about what had actually happened to Phasaelus, realizes that he's kind of trapped, and in the night sort of runs away. He takes a small retinue. I mean, run away isn't fair. He basically gets out of Dodge. He takes a small retinue, and he goes, I believe, to Masada. Yeah, that's right, Masada. And he basically leaves a lot of his relatives there under the protection of about 800 soldiers. Masada is a very, very defensible fortress. It would be one of the the siege of Masada would be one of the culminating points later on in the war between the Jews and the Romans. I believe it's the War of 70 AD, and so much later on. But that's to give you some indication of what Masada is like. It's sort of the fortress of Judea. Now, Herod himself doesn't actually stay there. He actually has this problem where too many people flock to support him, and Masada can't really hold them all. So his younger brother, Herod's younger brother, a guy named Joseph, counsels him to basically dismiss most of those people, leave as small a force as they can to hold Masada, and for Herod to basically get out of there. So Herod goes and he flees into the neighboring kingdom of Nabatea. Now, we've met Nabatea before, right? You remember that Herod's father, Antipater, had fled there when Aristobulus initially chases Hyrcanus out. So the hope that Herod has is that there's some kind of memory of that, and therefore that he might find some help among the Nabateans. However, the Nabateans don't really help him. Now, with Herod gone, the Parthians overrun the rest of Judea, essentially, with the exception of Masada, which they put under siege. And they install Antagonists Mattathias as king and high priest, and he is the last Hasmonean monarch to hold both offices. After being installed, Antigonus has Hyrcanus and Phasaelus brought before him. According to Josephus, Antigonus bites Hyrcanus' ears off. And the reason for that is that kind of act of mutilation would render Hyrcanus ineligible to ever occupy the office of high priest again. Phasaelus, for his part, in order to escape a similar indignity, commits suicide by apparently dashing his head against a rock. He doesn't, Josephus records that his hands are bound. He says he doesn't have command of his hands, or, of course, a sword, so he goes and chooses to smash his own head on a rock and meets his end that way. He does actually relate that there's two sort of accounts that Josephus relates about this. So one story says that he just commits suicide by smashing his head on a rock. The other is that he smashes his head on a rock but doesn't actually die, but that a surgeon sent by Antagonists to attend to him instead puts poison in the wound and he dies that way. However, before he dies, he does receive word that Herod has made good his escape. And Antagonists would reign as both king and high priest in Judea for the next 3 years as Antagonists II. Now, after being rebuffed in Nabatea, Herod travels to Rome itself. There he meets both with Mark Antony and Octavian, they hadn't quite fallen out yet, and sought their support. Mark Antony remembered Herod, and he had a good relationship with him, so he receives him very enthusiastically and promises to drive Antagonists and the Parthians out of Judea. He also promises to make Herod, quote, the king of the Jews. Octavian was similarly receptive to Herod's case. So next Herod went before the entire Roman Senate to argue his case, and basically the Senate confirms the promises that Mark Antony had made, that they would support Herod in his campaign to drive out the Parthians and to make Herod the king of the Jews. Meanwhile, back in Syria, the tide of the conflict turns against the Parthians. A very talented deputy of Mark Antony is a guy by the name of Publius Ventiius Bessus, launched a successful counterattack against the Parthians in 39 BC. Quintus Labienus, who is the leader of that Roman faction that had invaded with Parthian support, he is captured and subsequently executed. And then Publius Ventiius is able to overrun most of the territory that had been lost to the Parthians and to Labienus the year before. The Crown Prince Pacorus returns to Parthia. He gathers a new army and the next year launches another invasion of Roman territory. However, this time Ventiius is actually able to defeat him, and Pacorus is himself killed in the fighting. And Ventiius then recaptures the remaining recalcitrant territories, and even, according to Cassius Dio, compels Antigonus Mattathias to flee Jerusalem for at least a little while, although he does come back. One slide too far, there we go, thank you very much. At about the same time, Herod returns from Italy with Roman backing. Now, he joins forces with Ventiius Bassus, another guy by the name of Pompedius Silo, and another guy named Gaius Sosius, who are all Romans, and he begins to campaign into Judea. He first goes to relieve the siege of Masada, where obviously, as I said before, a number of his relatives were taking refuge and they were under siege. However, he first actually has to capture Joppa, that was holding out, but he does that without much trouble, and then goes to relieve the siege of Masada. However, Herod runs into a bit of a problem where one of his subordinates in the campaign basically directly disobeys an order Herod gives him, and they both have to go all the way up to, I believe, Mark Antony, to actually, who's up sort of in the north, to actually adjudicate the dispute. While he's gone, Herod leaves his brother Joseph in charge. However, Joseph is killed in an ambush. So just so we're keeping score here, Herod has now lost 2 of his 3 brothers in this war. Now, when Herod heard of the death of his brother, he was enraged and he redoubles his efforts in the campaign. The war at this point becomes considerably more brutal, as Herod seems to have just been absolutely consumed by rage. He first overruns 5 small cities, according to Josephus, and massacres 2,000 men in the region. He doesn't give a figure for women and children. Next, he defeats Antigonus' forces in battle, and Josephus paints a very vivid picture of the carnage that follows, which I'm going to read to you because it's rather evocative. Here we go. Now, other parts of their army made resistance for a while. That's Antigonus' army. But Herod, running the utmost hazard out of the rage he was in at the murder of his brother, that he might be avenged on those that had been the authors of it, soon beat those that opposed him. And after he had beaten them, he always turned his force against those that stood to it still, and pursued them all, so that a great slaughter was made. While some were forced back into the village from whence they came out, he also pressed hard upon the hindermost, and slew a vast number of them. He also fell into the village with the enemy, where every house was filled with armed men, and the upper rooms were crowded above with soldiers for their defense. And when he had beaten those that were on the outside, he pulled the houses to pieces and plucked out those that were within. Upon many he had the roofs shaken down, whereby they perished by heaps. And as for those that fled out of the ruins, the soldiers received them with their swords in their hands, and the multitude of those slain and lying in heaps was so great that the conquerors could not pass along the roads. So that's the tone and tenor that the conflict begins to take on at this point. Now, after these military triumphs, Herod marries into the Hasmonean line to basically further cement his claim to be king of the Jews. Having married into the Hasmonean line, Herod, along with the general Gaius Sosius, advanced to Jerusalem and placed it under siege. The siege, according to Josephus, lasts for 5 months. Antigonus's forces resist doggedly, but ultimately the force brought to bear by Herod and Gaius Sosius are able to capture the city. Antigonus himself is captured, and he is subsequently executed. Plutarch and Josephus both indicate that Antigonus was beheaded, whereas Cassius Dio suggests that he may have been crucified. And Herod would then go on to massacre most of his political opponents, although he was able to save the city from being looted by Roman soldiers by offering them money from his own personal treasury. Now, the war seems to have a profound effect on Herod's character. Josephus' account indicates that Herod would become extremely paranoid and prone to fits of violence. In the aftermath of the war, Herod eventually ultimately kills Hyrcanus when he is released from imprisonment in Parthia. He also kills at least two male relatives of his, and also his own wife, the Hasmonean princess Mariamne, after a spurious accusation of adultery basically made by Herod's mother and sister, who just didn't like her very much. He apparently comes to deeply regret this decision, but of course it's too late. And now we reach the conclusion, which basically, of course, my thesis for this whole thing, the Magi are representatives of the Parthian government. My argument basically boils down to, if the shoe fits, the way that Herod reacts in the book of Matthew when the Magi show up is consistent with, would be consistent when considered in light of what he had experienced in the War of 40 BC. So, just as a little bit of a summary here, I know this is sort of small. I hope you guys can at least sort of see it. There's a lot of information packed onto here. I probably should have broken it up into 2 slides, but oh well. So, in summary, this is sort of for my whole thesis. The Parthians had a bicameral council, known as the Sanhedrin, and perhaps called the Magisterium or Megasthenes, although that's not entirely clear. The council is comprised of an upper house of nobles and a lower house of wise men and magi. These were, according to Strabo, involved in some way or another in the selection of Parthian kings. The Parthians and the Romans were both seeking to expand their territory and their influence into Syria and the Levant. The Parthians and Romans took sides in a civil war in Hasmonean Judea. The Romans backed Herod and granted him the title of the King of the Jews. And during this war, the Parthians took over the country, chased Herod into exile, and were directly or indirectly responsible for the deaths of 2 out of the 3 of his brothers. This conflict had a noticeable effect on Herod, who became violent and paranoid afterwards. And so now, we're going to read the biblical account from Matthew. So here it says Matthew 2. I broke this one up into 2 slides, not that it probably makes it easier for most of you. Actually, maybe you can see it, I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, here's Matthew 2, 1 through 8. We're actually going to read all the way through verse 16. That's just on the next slide, though. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly, and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him. going through verse 16. After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, Out of Egypt I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Now, in this scenario, we see the wise men, or Magi, depending on the translation, coming from the east. Now, I will actually point out that depending on the translation you use, as I say there, you're going to see either wise men or Magi. I looked up both the Greek and the Latin, and both the Greek and Latin use the term Magi, for whatever that's worth. The only major political entity to the east would have been the Parthian Empire, where both wise men and Magi were official positions, and not only official positions culturally and societally, but politically as well. They come asking for the whereabouts of the King of the Jews, which is a title Herod officially held. The last time Parthians had come to install a king of the Jews, 2 of Herod's brothers were killed, and Herod had been forced to flee, and the Parthians had overrun the country. Now, Herod believes he had been tricked by the Magi when they do not report back to him, and if you read Josephus' account, I know we didn't really get into this too much in the lecture, but if you actually read Josephus' account, which I have here, I was just reading Plutarch there, sorry. Not that anyone really knew. But if you read Josephus' account, Josephus constantly talks about how Herod views the barbarians, i.e. the Parthians, as essentially untrustworthy. Now Herod, after this, reacts with extreme violence and paranoia, which is consistent with the way that he acts after the War of 40 BC. And it's also indicative that he took whatever the wise men had to say very, very seriously. And that basically wraps up this PowerPoint. And I think this is, we're at the end here. So that is essentially my thesis. I think for my money, if the shoe fits, wear it. I believe, based on all this, that the Magi from the Bible were representatives of the Parthian government, and that their presence really, really, really freaked out Herod, who thought they were about to basically try the same stunt they pulled in 40 BC. So thank you very much for coming out, and have a good rest of your evening. And if there's any questions, I guess we can take them now. For I don't know what time are we looking at here? 8:49. Yeah, we have time here. It's about an hour long. So is there any questions out there?
What was the main difference between the Roman governments and the Parthian governments? Like, because they allowed the Parthians to keep some of their traditions and their the way they the culture and the worship and which I don't know.
Well, the Romans allow the Jews in Judea to sort of maintain their religious practice after Pompey's siege in 63 BC. Is that what you're thinking of? Yeah. So Rome never actually conquers Parthia. So the question was basically, what are the differences between the Parthian government and the Roman government? And the answer is quite a bit. At this time, Rome is still technically a republic. Now, sort of towards the end, it's moving very close to becoming an empire officially. So we talked obviously a lot about the War of 40 BC. It's 31 BC when Octavian defeats Mark Antony, and just shortly, that's when he sort of becomes de facto sole ruler of the Roman state, but it's a few years after that he's actually named Augustus and becomes the first emperor. So Rome is operating as a republic, technically at this time. It is a republic that is, at this period, rife with political faction and a lot of political violence. Parthia, however, is a monarchy. It is openly a monarchy. Rome has a sort of an allergy to monarchy. Rome actually itself used to be a monarchy in its very earliest period. However, they chase out their monarchs somewhere around 500 BC. And after that, Rome has a real aversion to monarchy. And so even when Rome actually becomes an emperor, Octavian, who becomes Caesar Augustus, goes to great lengths to say that, oh, even though I'm emperor, I am merely first citizen. I am definitely not a king of any sort. And so there's actually the first sort of period of the Roman Empire, sometimes called the Principate, maintains the pretense that the emperor is ruling in a collegial fashion along with the Senate. But at this point, of course, Rome isn't quite an empire yet. It is still a republic. Parthia is a monarchy, and a monarchy with a council that's acting as basically an advisory board, or maybe a little bit more. Again, we don't quite know exactly what they did.
Like the Romans had a senate?
Yes, yeah. So the Romans did have a senate.
And the Parthians had an advisory?
Yes, yeah.
Which did the same thing?
Not quite. Again, we don't quite know what the Parthian Synhedrion did. We don't have a lot of information on it, unfortunately. The way the Roman Republican government was set up is actually really, really complicated, and I'm a little bit nervous to try to sort of give you an account of it from memory. There's basically multiple different legislative bodies that are all kind of interacting with one another. Technically speaking, you're in some sense very right, because we use the term Senate when we're talking about the Roman Republic very broadly. Technically, the Senate specifically does act just as an advisory board, even in Rome. It's actually things like the Comitia Centuriata and the Comitia Curiata and the Concilium Plebis that actually, and then I think there's one or two other, like the Popular Assembly or General Assembly is another one, that actually do the legislating. The Senate is sort of like a lot of these old semi-retired statesmen whose word is taken very, very seriously. They act as an advisory to all these legislative bodies. So yes, in some sense you're quite right that the Roman Senate as a specific body does act very, very similarly to the Parthian Synhedrion, or at least we think so, because again, we don't quite know what the Synhedrion really did. We don't know very much about it.
So did the Romans abandon Herod?
No, Herod continues to rule with Roman backing. So the question was, did Rome come to ultimately abandon Herod? And the answer is no. Herod continues to rule with Roman backing for the rest of his life. And actually his sons become the Herodian Tetrarchy. So his kingdom is sort of split between his four sons for a while. And so yeah, that's why you also get the Herod who beheads John the Baptist. Not the same Herod, right? Different Herod, but that's one of his sons. And now, yeah.
I was going to say, presumably the Magi would have been aware of Herod's title that he received from Rome, being King of the Jews.
Yeah, I'd say that's
Is that a
plausible, yeah.
fair assumption?
Yeah, I would say.
Okay. So the question that I would have is, or the observation in some respects is, they must have actually had a very strong sense of their own revelation of something prophetically coming that was the King of the Jews, in order to actually present that title directly to the one who theoretically held it. I wondered if you could comment upon what may have been going on there, because it seems like it's politically very provocative on some level, and what may have been some of their motivations surrounding that.
Yeah, so for those of you who maybe on the recording can't quite hear it, my dad, David, was just making the observation that, it's presumable that the Magi probably would have been aware that Herod held the title King of the Jews, so, it was a very provocative move for them to go to Herod and ask him where was he who was being born King of the Jews. And I would say, yes, you're quite right, that is very provocative. As to the sort of follow-up question, which is sort of like what's going on there in the background that sort of led up to that, I don't really know, and I don't know that I could really provide a good answer to that, because you could get into let's say like the use of astrology and things like that in the ancient Near East, but I don't know enough about that to really comment on that in a way that I think would be sort of edifying. It's just not. I just don't know enough about that to really provide an intelligent answer, unfortunately.
But it seems clear that they were confident in bringing that title.
Oh yes,
to Herod.
yes, yeah. They were definitely. There was clearly some confidence in going to Herod, the King of the Jews, and asking, "Where is he that has been born King of the Jews?" Yeah, you're absolutely right in that sense. Any other questions? All right, well, if there's no...
Hang on.
Yeah, go ahead.
One more. So, I just want to ask you, in light of the fact that you mentioned many, many dates...
Yes, yeah, lots of dates.
Do you think this is an accurately datable picture? Meaning, any comments on whether or not the Magi actually arrived at the birth or several years after?
Yeah, okay, so the question here is basically, do the Magi arrive at the birth of Jesus or a few years after? My sense is probably a few years after. For example, the biblical account says they arrive at a house, not at a stable or a cave. There's actually a tradition that the actual stable that Christ is born in is actually in a cave. That's just a bit of trivia. But yeah, there's no indication in the biblical account that they arrive there. They arrive at a house. And of course, when Herod goes and kills all the youngsters, he's looking for people 2 years old and younger. So it's possible that it might have been as much as 2 years later. But of course, it's all kind of conjectural. We don't really know. The biblical account doesn't give us sort of solid dates in that sense.
Did you do any readings on how many were actually killed in Bethlehem? Because the readings I've done on Bethlehem was tiny at that point, and it may only have been a handful of children. In fact, but it makes it seem like he slaughtered hundreds of children. Yeah, so the question there was, do we have a sense of how many children Herod killed in Bethlehem? And the answer is, again, we don't really know how many. It is worth noting that it also is Bethlehem and the surrounding region. We don't quite know how big of a region he might be referring to. It'd be very difficult to know for sure how many people might have been killed. Any other questions?
Like they went straight to Herod. Like they didn't go through they didn't have to work the way up. They went straight to Herod.
Yeah. So the question there is like, did the Magi go straight to Herod? And the answer, as far as we can tell from the biblical account, is yes. And that's another, I think, good piece of evidence that they were probably, they weren't just some random guys, right? One of the other sort of theories I've seen for the identity of the Magi is that they were essentially some Jewish mystics that had remained behind, maybe in sort of Babylonia after most of the Jews returned back to their homeland. The problem, I think, with this does actually hinge on the point you just raised there, which is that, if these are just sort of mystics, how do they just walk in and get an audience with the king? Clearly they have to be of sufficient, political status to walk in and just get an audience with the king, which, you're right, not just anybody is going to be able to do that. So that's another good sort of indication that these guys, whoever the Magi were apparently of sufficiently high status that they were able to do that.
So Herod must have known of their status and what they represented.
Yes. Right? Yeah. So and hence he took what they had to say very seriously. All right, well, is that it then? All right, well, thank you all for coming out. Thank you for your questions. And thank you for your time, and have a good rest of your evening.